While it is possible to play a single game unrelated to any other game events past or future, it is the campaign for which these rules are designed. It is relatively simple to set up a fantasy campaign, and better still, it will cost almost nothing. In fact, you will not even need miniature figures, although their occasional employment is recommended for real spectacle when battles are fought. A quick glance at the equipment section of this booklet will reveal just how little is required. The most extensive requirement is time. The campaign referee will have to have sufficient time to meet the demands of his players. He will have to devote a number of hours to laying out the maps of his dungeons and upper terrain before the affair begins. The third booklet of this set will be of great help in this respect, for a number of helpful suggestions regarding how to accomplish it all have been given in order to help you accomplish the task with a minimum of time and effort. There should be no want of players, for there is unquestionably a fascination in this fantasy game, evidenced even by those who could not by any stretch of the imagination be termed ardent wargamers. The longevity of existing campaigns, notably Blackmoor in the Twin Cities and Greyhawk in Lake Geneva, and the demand for these rules for people outside these campaigns point towards a fantastic future. Tactical Studies Rules believes that of all forms of wargaming, fantasy will soon become the major contender for first place. The section of this booklet entitled Scope will provide an idea of just how many possibilities are inherent in Dungeons and Dragons. These rules are strictly fantasy. Those wargamers who lack imagination, those who don't care for Burroughs' Martian adventures where John Carter is groping through black pits, who feel no thrill upon reading Howard's Conan saga, who do not enjoy the de Camp and Pratt fantasies of or Fritz Lieber's Fafhrud and the Grey Mouser, pitting their swords against evil sorceries, will not be likely to find Dungeons and Dragons to their taste. But those whose imaginations know no bounds will find that these rules are the answer to their prayers. With this last bit of advice, we invite you to read on and enjoy a world where the fantastic is fact and magic really works. From E. Gary Gygax, Tactical Studies Rules Editor, November 1st, 1973, Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Excerpt from the introduction of the original Dungeons & Dragons White Box by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. Hello and welcome. I wanted a stirring reading of one of the very first things that probably has ever really been read about role-playing games by the role-playing game enthusiast. It is straight out of the White Box of Dungeons & Dragons, first page, pretty much. It spoke to me to speak about that because I'm trying something a little different with this episode. This episode of what? Oh my goodness, I should probably start with an introduction. Welcome to I Am the Party, and I am Paul. In this episode of I Am the Party, like I said, I'm trying something a little bit differently. I wanted to talk my process, the things that I'm using nowadays, 2.5 months in, 3 months in, however many months, the amount of time that I've spent kind of refining, figuring out what works for me. That's really been a whole goal of this podcast in the first place, is for me to discover what passions I have, if solo role-playing is even a thing that I care about, beyond just the idea of like, oh, that'd be nice. I could just do it on my own. I'm completely flexible and free to schedule my own games, to plan out my own campaigns, to be my own audience. Is that even something that I want to do? Good news for me, and hopefully if you enjoy the show, good news for you. It is something I want to do. It's something I'm really, really loving. I've kind of seen this development of my campaign over the course of the first 11 or so episodes, really only 8 or 9 that were story focused. And so I wanted to take this opportunity this week to reflect back on the growth that I've personally had in figuring out what I want to do for this podcast, how I want to run my own game, share that. One of the other aspects, other than just for my own sake to talk about what has worked for me, one of the other aspects of the podcast was hopefully to inspire others to take the leap, to just jump right in. This kind of harkens back to an older Man Alone, the YouTube channel Man Alone. His podcast, I guess not really podcast, his YouTube channel, his videos. One of them is just titled like Just Start. And I really love his straightforward and kind of blunt titles for his videos, and also the messaging that he has. That's what really got me wanting to jump in myself into Just Start. And so I'm going to pass that message on for anyone who needs to hear it. Just start. Just jump in. I'm going to talk today about how I just started. That worked for me. Might not work for you, but there's a lot of other examples out there. The more the merrier as far as that goes. This is really, as much as it is a solo, and it's literally called solo, you're alone, RPGs as a concept, as much as it is like a single person working on it. There's actually a pretty great community out there that I've found of other like-minded individuals who provide guidance or provide resources, tools. I don't think there's a big surprise when you think about how much it overlaps with like the OSR community, partially because the rules are really there to be used as a structure and a scaffolding rather than a very coherent game engine. For a lot of the OSR type of of games. That's why I've used Cairn. I'll talk more about that in a minute. The OSR community has a very similar mutual support, mutual aid even approach to the hobby. Encourage you to reach out. My podcast is just one. There's so many others out there. There's a couple of subreddits that are dedicated to solo RPGs. Don't worry about the stigma of playing a role-playing game, of playing D&D by yourself. If you're listening to this, you probably imagine it one way or another, even if you're not sitting down rolling dice, pulling out an adventure, rolling up characters, even if you're just daydreaming. Going back to one of my core beliefs from Geeks Gamers is everything is play. So we all do it. Anything you're planning, if you're planning an adventure, if you're thinking about a character's backstory, that's play. That's solo role-playing if you're doing it by yourself. Where does that leave me? Well, I have a couple of topics I want to talk about today in regard to that, in regard to solo role-playing and my particular style. I want to start this conversation about my style of role-playing by talking about what motivated me, why I was even interested in the idea of playing a solo RPG. And for me, it was a number of factors. This probably is true for everybody, but for my number of factors, they included the inability to really get a regular group going in person. I have a group that I get to meet with about once every other month. We just play general board games, group of friends. It's really valuable time, and it's like basically a way for us to make sure we're still connecting and to be in each other's company and enjoy the time we have together. But it doesn't really scratch the itch long term of classic, huge, massive D&D campaign. And so that's something that I have really been wanting and hankering for a while, the idea of playing something in person. I also have an online group of friends that also includes some family. They're wonderful, but it's also not the same feeling of that in-person around the table with a bunch of people playing this campaign, rolling dice. And the more I'm talking about this, the more I'm just kind of smiling to myself that like I'm still not really doing that in this situation, but bits and pieces of the experience of an in-person campaign, kind of the campaign that I've always dreamed of wanting to run or play in to see how it would work. I have a long-standing interest in running something heavily inspired by the Malazan Book of the Fallen. I wear those inspirations very proudly, very transparently, and I've also found myself taking some other inspirations of things that I love. I've mentioned in past episodes House of Leaves, the Berserk manga. It's one of my favorites. Lord of the Rings, of course. There's a lot. There's a lot of influences. So going back to what made me want to play a solo RPG, did I always think about wanting to play it on a podcast and create like recordings and have other people potentially judge me? I started out my solo RPG path by buying a bunch of stuff. I think that's also something that Man Alone has a video about, is just the idea of like person who gets into a solo RPG itch, who gets into that and really wants to explore it. Usually the first step is just like buying so many books, so many different game systems, trying to find that game where it's like, this is the one where I'm going to finally learn and understand how to solo RPG, because we think that there's something magical about it. And there is something magical. I don't want to take away the magic about the experience that I've had creating my own podcast and solo RPG campaign. It's not put behind a gate. There's no gatekeepers in solo RPGs, really. You're your own gatekeeper. That's the thing that I think is a big, consistent aspect of people who can't seem to find the way to start just doing it and start getting the habit is the habit. Start getting into the hobby or the habit of solo RPGs is the self-gatekeeping. There's a reason that I spent a lot of time a couple episodes back talking about True Fun, because I think as I've been reading through that book and also comparing my own experiences, listening to other people's experiences in gaming, that True Fun piece where the flow is such a huge portion of fun and enjoying something and not letting yourself get out of flow or finding ways to limit the things that will pull you out of flow, that's been huge for me. Self-judgment, self-criticism, that's a huge pitfall, and it's one of the easiest ones to find yourself just jumping into the pit maybe. And I know this metaphor is not going anywhere, but just finding a way to start to peel back the layers of like, why do you feel so critical about yourself and what's stopping you ultimately? Those are the questions you got to ask yourself. It's going to be different for everybody. For me, it actually really reminded me going through this process of getting into solo RPGs it reminded me of my time originally trying to figure out RPGs in general, tabletop role-playing, whether more traditional, whether you're in a group. For me, in person, it was kind of before online TTRPG action was really a norm. So like 25 years ago at this point. That process I went through originally for tabletop role-playing was just seeking out any piece of advice, any guidance. I had nobody to teach me because I didn't know anybody who played Dungeons & Dragons at the time. It was 3.5. That was kind of the era. We were right in the thick of it. Everything was D&D compatible, and I didn't know anybody. I played some miniature games at the time. There wasn't the same structure that is in place now, not nearly, where you can look up a game store's website and see when their Adventure League night is and just jump in, take the chance on playing a game with a bunch of strangers. There certainly were ways to connect with other people back then, but I was not going to do it. I was holding myself in reserve. As a result, I was thinking, how am I going to learn how to do this? I was looking at every starter box product. I have very fond memories of idolizing this. Must have been based on 3.5 D&D Star Wars box set that came with a unique special Wookiee action figure. Maybe I had to send away for it. I can't remember. Such a concept of, if I just had this and I just read it, it would unlock role-playing. It would unlock what D&D even looked like. Thinking back and seeing how we have so many examples. My podcast is just one to name one of millions of different examples of role-playing by different people, different styles, different games. The idea of actual plays in general being something that people care about. If I had that back then, probably would have just tried to inundate myself with as many videos of actual plays, and I probably would end up feeling like that wasn't for me. One of the ironic things about having my own podcast and enjoy being recorded is that I actually don't really enjoy listening to actual plays of other people very much. I would rather just play. That's another reason I came to the podcast and to solo RPGing, is I would rather myself play and discover my own things, be, again, my own best audience, or most important audience member, than listen to other people play. Bringing it back to the idea of how was I going to learn about RPGs in the first place? That answer is what unlocked the answer to why I started this podcast, because what I ended up doing, my research thoroughly on what it would be a good system, what would I feel confident in, and I picked up the Dread RPG book. Dread, if you're not familiar with that, my favorite RPG of all time, especially favorite RPG to play in a group of people who have never played role-playing games before but want to try it out. Dread is designed for one-shots, and the idea is, instead of dice or anything, you have a Jenga tower, and instead of rolling to see if someone's successful in something, they have to pull a block from the Jenga tower, and if the tower falls over, something terrible happens to the character. Most likely death and dismemberment of some kind. This rule system is incredibly straightforward and simple. There's probably really 3 or 4 rules, and it's more of a structure-based kind of game. Picking Dread up, reading through it, playing through in my own head, again, everything is play, but kind of DMing the intro scenario from the Dread core book made me feel confident, and I wrote down so many notes, just like classic first-time GM in any kind of game system. I wrote so many thorough notes, basically copying out the entire scenario into my notebook to prepare for this Dread scenario, and I ended up running it for a group of people. Just like I mentioned, I didn't know anybody who had played D&D before, but mostly family, siblings, their significant others. Ran it for them, and nobody else had ever played. I'd never played anything, GM'd or not, but I ran this game, and it was super fun. I still have distinct light bulb flashing memories of playing in my brother's basement at his house with him and my sister and their significant others. It definitely was an experience that I was taking a risk on. I didn't know if it was going to be, if it was going to work, and if anyone was going to even really enjoy it, but it started something in me, and, I guess at 25 years later, here I am. Going back to why I started this podcast and how I started with my solo RPG life was that I just decided to give it a shot. Just start going back to Man Alone. What was holding me back? Well, I don't know. I don't know what was holding me back. I was asked recently, what made me decide to want to start now? Why was it special in January of 2025? I will say I know what spurred it on was I needed a distraction from real life. I wanted something that was going to be a project. When I have really stressful moments, situations in my life, I've found that I get really into a hobby, and usually it's a new hobby for a lot of different reasons, and I think that was what was the impetus to get me to actually start playing. And also, I was looking around my bookshelves, and I thought, there's so many books, there's so many products here. Why do you own all these things? What makes you happy? Is it just to buy? Is it to own? Or is it to use? Those are all 3 very different things. What's the point of it? So originally my idea was I'm going to start playing through all of these Dungeon Crawl Classic dungeons that I have. I kind of reverse engineered. I needed a system that could be flexible enough to run a DCC adventure, but also kind of embrace the structure of a dungeon crawl. I love the Dungeon Crawl Classics rules. I think they're super fun. A great investment for anyone, especially if you get it at a convention for $10 for the paperback. It has a ton of resources in it, but I also knew if I was going to run an adventure with several characters, the characters are already too complex. And they're not that complex compared to some systems, but they were too complex for me to be shuffling a bunch of character sheets around. So I ended up starting, if you heard my first couple episodes, with a cobbled together system, and I wasn't unhappy with the system, but the more I worked at it and the more I realized, as if I'm going to make it this a podcast, if I'm going to be my own GM, I need to still distill it down further and maybe have something that is already a little bit more established. And I had this tiny little Karn, someday I'll learn how to pronounce it, but that tiny little rule book. And I knew that there was a second edition that had been recently kickstarted, and I knew that there was going to be more material out for it. I started to pick up the extra books that were out there. The whole set is like less than $20 for a bestiary, player's guide, the original version edition rule book. I started to read into that, and I've always been a very light rules light guy, even when I run games for other people, because I don't want the rules to get in the way. I want them to get out of the way and allow me to be in the moment, be in that flow with players. So Karn ended up being the system that I was most drawn to. And now I've played a good amount of it. I've only really have one big combat under my belt using the system, but it did its job. I was very happy playing the battle with Talls and Mender and Mort. Alas, poor Mort. The three of them versus that giant. It was good. And now I'm going to shift gears a little bit as I'm starting to talk about the actual experience I've had recording my sessions and talk more about the tools that I have ended up using. So I mentioned Karn. I use all three of the books that I mentioned previously. I have the PDF of I believe it's the Warden's Guide, which is like the DM's guide for the second edition. So I can expand out if I need to. I find that I don't, so far, there could be a point in the future, but so far I don't really take advantage of some of the more procedural rules that are in Karn. Dungeon crawl rules, dungeon turns, wilderness turns, that kind of stuff. I think I'll use those as I feel like I want to explore that part of the story if it becomes relevant. It's just good to know that I have this tool set, this toolbox within these rules. They are accessible for me, and also that I can bring in other things, which continue to go through my pile of books that are sitting right here next to me. The Dragonbane Bestiary, I mentioned that I used that during the fight with the giants. Honestly, I used it just for the description that I read at the beginning of the episode, and then also the actions table where you roll a d6 and determine from turn to turn what the creature's going to do. I also used the art and the standees from the Dragonbane box set, and I believe I have the Bestiary set as well for the standees. Using all of that for me was like fun visually. I'm a big miniatures guy. I love painting miniatures, but the standees, like I've wanted a reason to use these anyway. So it's another example of these are sitting on my shelf. I've had it for a while. Let's break them out. Let's get some use of them. And it worked super well. So I've been happy with that. I think I'll continue to go to the Dragonbane pool of resources as far as more visuals for my own sake. I don't really need those for a lot of the play. The first episode where we meet Cal and Arthur Brim, I didn't have anything in front of me other than some stats on an index card. That was really all that I needed in order to GM that session, and then the dice were using the stats. The dice were going to help me figure out what the characters were going to do. So I didn't really need miniatures in that case, and I imagine the miniatures will break out every time that I have like a more involved combat. That was the first time in that episode with the giant fight that I even needed to use those, but those were useful. And then I also have a dice rolling box covered in cat fur because we have cats here, and some gold dice that I got actually were a gift from a coworker a couple years back, and they're kind of sentimental, so I've been happy to be able to break those out. What else do I have? The big book of battle mats, and I use this for that stone giant fight. They're Loke, Loke battle mats. I think I got this on Amazon. They're just square grids, but it's got roughly 30 different 2-page spread, plain grass, ruins of a castle, village with rooftops, all the kind of basic battle mats. It served me really well for a couple different sessions. It's just very handy to have something like this. I love that it's flat, it's spiral bound, dry erase, everything you need just for a very improv heavy kind of game. And then beyond that, another very cheap, inexpensive product that I again think I got on Amazon. It's like a clipboard, but it's double wide, so it's kind of 2 pieces of paper wide, and I use that just for management of my character sheets. Again, another reason I chose Karn. The character sheets are so simple. Going back to that, can have 3-4 characters all on one single piece of paper and have pretty full character details that I need on there. And then I have some additional index cards as kind kind of the unsung hero of my podcast and of my solo RPG. I use index cards constantly. They work really well for the gear slots each player character has. So all of that's worked really well for me. So those are my tools. I have some nice pencils because I don't know where I think there was a solo RPG gift guide. I asked my wife to get me nice pencils and she did. So I have those types of things, taking advantage of, it's my own space and it's essentially my battle station. I was thinking about that. That's kind of the way to put it is, and I took a picture too of all this stuff kind of laid out. The idea of like your solo RPG battle station. Those are the things that I've got here with me that I plan on using and continue to use regularly. I talked in the very first episode about random tables, and I have like so many more resources, whether it's PDFs or actual physical printed books as well. So if I find myself needing something, I feel fortunate in that I've already hoarded and collected a lot of resources that I don't feel like I need to go out and really add to that. Here's another reason to add to the table for solo RPGing. It can be basically free. One of the cheapest ways of an already potentially inexpensive hobby and role playing. It's been wonderful from that perspective as well. It's an unpredictable time. The more we can take advantage of things that we already have and not have to feel that drive to purchase the next cool game, the next new thing. And don't get me wrong, there are a ton of amazing looking solo RPGs out there. A lot of them worth your time. But for me, cobbling together Cairn and these other systems and these other resources, that's worked really well. Basically, the last thing on this topic goes is just what my process looks like. So I have all these tools, these resources. I've explained the why that I got into solo RPGs in the first place. But how do I do then take all of that and go week to week with this story, this campaign that I'm running? And I was talking about this in a previous episode, but I think one of the biggest aha moments that I've had playing a solo RPG and playing kind of like solo D&D essentially is the flipping of the expectation for the new solo role player, and that I need that oracle, or I need some AI type game engine, like any kind of oracle that has been written up or created by a human being. The idea is that I need the GM to be emulated. I need something to surprise me and to make me feel like I'm experiencing a story as a player. There's nothing wrong with that. I respect that. I respect that perspective of other forever game masters who are like, I just want to be able to play a game for once. I just have this idea for this really cool character, and I'd love to see how they play out in a story, but I don't want to be responsible for the story. I want to be surprised by things. Nothing wrong with it. My aha moment came when I realized that, no, I actually love being a GM. I love having the idea and the person, the architect behind the whole campaign and adventure. And that's not to say that I have like 2 sessions planned out or anything like that. I don't even have like the next session planned out. I don't have a strict outline. I have an idea hits me from time to time why I have a weekly episode release rather than like a daily episode release, because I want inspiration to hit me. But every episode that I've had, especially post Rift of Seeping Night, which was a pre-written adventure module and a dungeon crawl, but especially those episodes after that, it's been week to week. I've been inspired by something I'm reading or thinking about or seeing. It could be in real life. It could be in a movie. It could be in the book that I'm reading. I get inspired constantly. Then I bring that back into my campaign world and think, I'm the GM. I'm planning things out. How could this play out? What's the potential for story here? And so when I come to a session that I'm recording for the podcast, I have maybe 2-3 bullet points of like, this could happen, and then this could happen, and then this could happen. We'll see what happens. Karen's a good example of this, but normal is not the right word, any traditional RPG that's designed for one game master and 3 to 5 players or whatever, what have you, that's already going to be giving me the capacity to emulate player characters. I've relied way more on luck and determination, or determining randomly dice rolls, fate, whatever you want to call it. I've way more relied on that aspect to see what my characters will do. Characters grow over time. And that goes back to my original idea for my game engine where everyone has a motivation randomly rolled. And that has really been like a driving force behind my characters in my campaign. And I've really grown to enjoy my characters. I can't wait to see how Talls is going to grow. She's been through a lot already. And last time when we left off, she just saw another member of her squad, her last surviving member of her squad, take a death blow from this giant, somehow coming back to life. Like, that's wild from Tal's perspective. I can't wait to see how Tal's copes with that. To speak to Mender as well, I've discovered a lot about Mender through playing, like the fact that Mender's name is now Mender instead of Sarge. They're non-binary. Their war history. Last episode, I was talking about how Mender, when they were Sarge, probably was in some pretty unjust wars as a member of the Helenar Empire. I didn't know that. that just kind of came out of nowhere, but I started to put that together, and now I'm interested to find out more about Mender's past as Sarge and before they were Sarge, what brought them there. And I think I'm going to have more opportunities to roll that out and to discover that. Those are the types of things that make me really excited. I also have ideas for some other plot lines in this campaign. This is again where like the Malazan Book of the Fallen inspiration comes into play. Those books, and Steven Erikson, when he writes them, there's so many plot lines going on, and I'm not going to reach that, hopefully, that level of complexity, but I do think that I've got some different ways that I can like explore other characters in this story. Just like how I'm already starting to go down that path a little bit when I brought in the Brims. I've ended up having Talz and Mender running into them and having the story kind of unite that way. That's like a very, very micro, small version of what I imagine the overall campaign will end up being like. That's what my hope is. I want to tell a story from multiple perspectives, points of view. Again, Karen, give me the tools. It's giving me the level of complexity. It's really easy to roll up new characters. That's what motivates me. That's what drives me to want to play and see what happens next. Would love to hear from you, dear listener, if you have thoughts, if there's something holding you back. What's your gate that's up and not letting you engage in solo role-playing like you want to? Or what are the successes? What are the drives? What makes you want to play a solo RPG? Those are really interesting things to me to hear more about and to learn about. You can always reach me at my email account, which is iamthepartypodcast@gmail.com. I am also on Bluesky at iamtheparty.bsky.social. Please give me a follow if you're all interested in hearing more about this or getting updates about how my campaign is going, how my episodes are coming along. Good conversation have. Otherwise, I also do have a YouTube channel. You can always leave a comment. If you're listening on YouTube right now, welcome. You can always leave a comment here. So anyways, that's a little about me. I look forward to hearing maybe from some of you to hear about what's interesting to you, why you're listening, what you're finding enjoyable. If hopefully you're finding this enjoyable, let me know. Reach back out. As always, I appreciate you so much for listening, and we will talk again soon. So long.